Welcome to Nightlight. Step away from the mainstream and gather around as we enlighten the world and our realities and travel this cosmic journey we call life. Join us as we share with you and provide that beacon that can guide us all to a better way. Explore with us as we examine a metaphysical montage of spiritual insights, covering everything from the mundane to the magical, UFOs to unicorns, and everything in between. This is a time of awakening, of sharing and evolving, of spreading our wings and soaring on the cosmic breath of creation. Come and join with other light-minded spirits as we weave our lights together to seek understanding, enlightenment, and, with a little luck, some wisdom. This is Nightlight, a reminder that you are never alone.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another fascinating recreation of history for Nightlight. We have Mark Dawidziak returning tonight. He's been a guest 3 or 4 times. We've covered his diverse writings on pop culture, like Kolchak, the Night Stalker, Everything I Needed to Know I Learned in the Twilight Zone, Shawshank Redemption, the 25th anniversary book, and he has a new book that just came out, and it covers all the mysteries surrounding Edgar Allan Poe's untimely death. It is entitled A Mystery of Mysteries, The Death and Life of Edgar Allan Poe. And it's available on Amazon and other fine bookstores. You can learn more about Mark by going to his website, markdawidziak.com. That is DAWIDZIAK. Let's just bring on Mark now. Hi, Mark. How are you?
Good, Mark. How you been doing?
Oh, I am fine. I am so glad you're here. I really enjoyed your book. Well, I've enjoyed all your books.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's see. I'm surrounded by. Let's see. I have about half a dozen pages, front and back, of notes. Maybe that will. We could extend this into about 4 shows, and I'm surrounded by several other books, and it's about ready to cause my desk to collapse. But I was trying to do a lot of prep for this show, but we had, some of our friends have been guests, like Mark Olshaker, and we'll be talking about him and John and his partner John Douglas and the profiling, and Dan Stashour, and Dan's I think coming up in June for his new book American Demon.
Mm-hmm.
And I've had him on a show, like a previous incarnation of this show. Over 5 years ago. He's fantastic.
Dan's a great guy.
Yeah, fantastic author and speaker. Yeah. Chris Sempner's been a guest a few times with me, and we've covered the Poe Shrine, so plus other notes and things I have pulled up on my computer. So if the floor doesn't collapse on me, the computer may blow up. But there is no shortage of Poe information. But well, since in your book you do mention Poe's influence on the Sgt. Pepper album, SpongeBob, South Park. So I want to make kind of another related pop culture allusion. In Throw Mama from the Train, the college professor Billy Crystal collects his night classes short stories, and he has a meltdown over Danny DeVito's story, and he's telling him you can't have a 2-page murder mystery with one character dead on the first page. This isn't a whodunit. And he's like, why do I get these people signing up for my class? And you start off your book where we know the main guy's dead in the first sentence, but since you're a college professor and a really smart guy, I kind of have a feeling that you're exploring a whole lot more of the story than what meets the eye. So you turn a book into in the beginning, the outcome, but you make it almost like Poe wrote this, what you wrote. It's in his style. It really, crafty. I don't know what the right word is. It's masterfully created with all the flashbacks and introducing all these characters. It's really a fascinating story, even though we know the ending.
Well, yes, but that's the fascinating thing about Poe is most biographies start where most lives start. They start with somebody's birth. That's a logical place to start any biography. Poe's biography somewhat inevitably starts with his death because it's one of the most fascinating things about him. It's one of the most enduring things about his legend, and it's also so reflective of how of what he did. Poe pulls off one of the great literary stage exits of all time by dying in a manner which reflects his two greatest literary accomplishments. He dies under horrific circumstances, which would not be out of place in one of his own horror stories, and he leaves us with a mystery. He leaves us, in fact, with a double-barreled mystery of not only how he died, what he died of, but also the missing days between when he leaves Richmond and then when he is discovered delirious on the streets of Baltimore a few days later. And nobody knows for certain the answer to either of those questions. So Poe dies in not just this incredible moment shrouded in mystery, but in a way that actually reflects his own writing. Well, that's just amazing. I mean, you couldn't have planned it any better.
Right.
If a publicity guy had come to him and said, "Let's have you die at 40," in a manner which is going to be to echo your greatest writing. How can you even begin to think about how you pull that off? There are three great literary stage exits in history. The first is Molière. Molière was not just a playwright, but an actor. He was dying of tuberculosis. He makes it through a performance of one of his own plays. He's dying of tuberculosis. He collapses midway through the play. They revive him into wings. He comes back. He finishes the play, and he goes home and he dies. Well, that's pretty good for an actor. That is a pretty good stage exit for an actor. And then you have, Mark Twain, who correctly predicts that he will die when Halley's Comet comes back. He was born with Halley's Comet in the night sky in 1835, and he predicts he will die when Halley's Comet returns in 1910, and he pulls that off. Those are two pretty good stage exits, but in some ways Poe beats them all because he dies in this way that has kept us talking about him. So the book starts, at the moment, most biographies end. This reverses. And it's one of the things that makes biographies inherently depressing. We know how it's going to end. If you're covering a full life with a biography, we know that in the end, the subject has got to die. So there's something inherently depressing about most biographies. But with Poe, if you start with the death, and ultimately you build to the point of saying, this is not going to trap him. In fact, this is going to liberate him. Poe has a line in The Pit and the Pendulum, where the narrator of The Pit and the Pendulum says, no, not even in the grave, not even in the grave is all lost. And Poe is sort of saying that to us over the centuries. He's going to escape the grave and become the most alive American writer of the 21st century. And it's not even close. He's the most read American writer, not just in this country, but around the world. He's enormously popular in Europe, in Asia, all over the world. And Poe has the last laugh. He escapes the grave. He escapes the attempts to bury him under myth and mystery and mythology and misinformation. He escapes all of the attempts to bury him physically and bury him in a more allegorical sense. And he escapes all of that and emerges as this amazingly alive presence. So in a way, it's the reverse, and it's not as depressing. But everybody thinks of Poe as a depressing person, but his life and his literary accomplishment, he's going to outlive all the people who were supposed to outshine him and outlive him. Where are they today? Where are the Emersons? Where are the Longfellows? Where are all the American geniuses that were going to? Would the average American even recognize these people? Would they be able to pick them out of a police lineup? You all know what Poe looks like. You know, if I say Edgar Allan Poe, you've got an image of what he looks like. And there's only two American writers that's true of. And they're both 19th century giants, Mark Twain and Edgar Allan Poe. Black and white. We always think of Poe dressed in black, and you always think of Twain dressed in white. And they specialized. What the things that have kept them alive for a long time is, for Twain it was humor, and for Poe it was horror. And humor and horror are twins. They are the flip side of the same coin. They are the metaphoric writing that we use to address painful subjects we don't like to think about. These two areas give us metaphoric uses for wrapping our mind around those things. Big subjects, big, towering subjects. So Poe is, it's interesting. You said earlier that, that I'm a college professor, and I wince a little bit at that because I'm not really. I'm not a doctor or a full-fledged professor. I have taught adjunct courses. So I play at being a professor. I play one on television, but I'm not really a professor. And, it's like when people say that you're an actor, and I do act, and I have acted for many years, but I shrivel a little bit about that because there are many fine actors, and it's tough to say, but I'm a writer. I mean, first and last, I'm a writer. And this book is about a writer. This book is about the true writer, the true person who wrote those stories. And that's one of the greatest mysteries of it. Even more, the greater mystery is not how Edgar Allan Poe died. The greater mystery is how he lived. Because we have this amazing, terrible, awful misconception about Poe. And it has been drummed into us, and it has been marketed. That's the Poe that's marketed. We recognize him. Fame's a double-edged sword for Poe. On the one hand, a small little group of stories have kept his reputation alive. But they have also created this almost funhouse mirror reflection of Poe. He's the grandfather of goth. He's the guy up in the attic huddled over the manuscript, cobwebs all around him, a raven perched on his shoulder, a quill pen in his hand, a bottle of cognac at reach, and a red-eyed black cat prowling through the attic as he spins these fever dream stories, probably on drugs or alcohol. And none of that's true. Not any part of that is true. That's not Edgar Allan Poe was. That's the myth we've created. And we've created this kind of grandfather of goth image for him, and we market that. And, is that a part of who Poe was? Of course it was. Was he drawn to that kind of material? Absolutely. Not only was he drawn to it, he was better at it than anybody else. He, as Ray Bradbury once said to me, Edgar Allan Poe took the horror story and he made literature out of it. That's exactly what he did. That's about, and Ray Bradbury was a pretty smart guy. So that's exactly what Poe did. So, and then in his spare time, he creates the mystery story, the modern mystery story, the detective story. At the same time, when I started writing this book, and people learned that I was writing this book, one of the first things they would say to me was, "Oh, I love Edgar Allan Poe. I've read everything he's written." And as soon as they said that, and I wouldn't say it out loud because that would be churlish to do that, but every time they said, "Oh, I've read everything he's written," in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, really? You've read all 17 volumes? And if you did say that out loud, they look wide-eyed at you. Like, what are you talking about? I've got this collection that says The Complete Tales and Poems of Edgar Allan Poe. Yes, that's just a small fraction of what he wrote. He was also a humorist. He wrote as much humor as he wrote horror. And nobody thinks of Edgar Allan Poe as a comedy writer, now do they? But nope. He had a great sense of humor. He was very witty, very funny, could be very charming and very genial. And he wrote as much humor. We just don't read the humor today. We read the scary stories. That's what made his reputation. And in his lifetime, Poe was not even best known as a short story writer, a fiction writer. He was best known as a critic in his lifetime. He was known as a very harsh, exacting critic of American literature because he believed that American literature would never grow up, would never escape the long shadow of Europe until it broke free of those bonds and created its own literature. So he had very high standards for his own country's literature, and he was so harsh in his criticism that he was known as the Tomahawk Man. But he was a great critic. He was, and this is lost by people, is that this is completely lost to most people, that not only was he best known as a critic, he was really good at it. His judgments hold up today because the literature he condemned has been wiped away. You would never have even heard of it. And the stuff that he championed, he recognized the genius of Nathaniel Hawthorne. His judgments were pretty sound and pretty correct. So in Poe's lifetime, he was known best as a critic, secondarily as a poet, and third as the author of short stories, horror, and mystery. Our century has reversed that. We know him first as a short story writer, second as a poet, and third, if you know it at all, as a critic. So we have this completely skewed view of Poe. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to write the book. I wanted to somewhat rescue Poe's reputation, because the myth suggests that Poe wrote these stories out of some kind of madness and obsession. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that sells him short as an artist. He was not that guy. He was a very exacting artist. He revised his work constantly. He was very careful. He was the first American writer who tried to make his living completely on his literary efforts as a writer and an editor. Not that he was tremendously successful at that, but most writers of that time had other jobs. The most successful, even Washington Irving had to take government jobs. He was an ambassador
Melville did that too.
Melville did too, and
Hawthorne.
others. Hawthorne. Longfellow had a teaching job. They worked at universities. They worked in government positions. They worked in the local parishes. They all had other jobs. Poe was the first to bravely try to make it through his own talents at a time when there was no copyright laws and people could reprint what you wrote and not pay you for it. So he made very, very little money, shamefully little money off of what he wrote. But he never stopped trying. And in all this time, and I think that there's a feeling that, Poe, another myth about Poe was that he was perpetually drunk. And the truth is that Poe had very long periods of sobriety. And he only lived to be 40. And he wrote enough to fill 17 volumes. And it's of a very, very high quality. And it's not just the horror stories. It's not just the mystery stories. It's not just the poetry. It's not just the criticism. It's not just the humor. It's all of these things. And so Poe was a versatile writer. And we've, missed him as far as probably what he looked like. There are only 8 known photographs of Poe, what we call daguerreotypes. And the vast majority of them were taken in the last 2 years of his life, when his health was starting to fall apart. So our view of Poe is primarily based on a handful of daguerreotypes taken in the last 2 years of his life. He didn't even grow the mustache until the last 2 or 3 years of his life. And we can't even imagine Poe without that little mustache. But
right.
he didn't wear it for the majority of his life. He lived to be 40, and he probably grew it at the age of 37. We do have an early daguerreotype without the mustache, and we do have a few paintings, portraits done of him. But it still does not expand our visual sense of Poe, because all of these paintings and all of these photographs, you could put them all together, and they all come from the period 1843 to 1849, the last 6 years of his life. We have no record before that.
And just on Facebook today, there was, the Chris's Poe Museum in Richmond had that posted the ambrotype.
Mm-hmm.
It's one of those daguerreotype photo type with a what do you call it, like an embroidery around it. That was
badly in need of restoration. Badly in need of being restored. It's all faded. It's disintegrated, and so it's a relic that needs to that badly needs to be restored. But it still falls into it again. If you look at all the images that we have of Poe, they all come from the same group of pictures. They all go back to the same group of pictures. There were a lot of engravings done of Poe over the year, but when you look at them closely, you say, that's based on that 1848 daguerreotype, or that's based on the daguerreotype that was taken in Providence, or that's the one from Richmond. You get to know them very, very quickly. They just aren't. Again, they're just. And that's one of the things that's created the mystery of Poe, is that Poe's life is not very well documented in a lot of ways. One, he lived at a time when there wasn't the documentation day in, day out of somebody's life that there is going to be just a few years later. He was born in 1809. There are many, many long periods of Poe's life where we have no idea what he was doing. What was he doing on this day? Never mind this day. What was he doing that year? There are long periods where there's just not good documentation for what his day-to-day existence was like. Now, if Poe had been born, a few years later, we would have had an excellent record of his life. Mark Twain is born in 1835. Twain's life is very well documented. We practically can account for almost every day of Twain's life. And that's not true of Poe. And we also have this small little group of pictures. If Poe had lived into the second half of the 19th century, he may have lived to the era of the Kodak, the candid photograph where anybody could take pictures. You did not have to go into a studio and sit really stiff and hold a pose for many seconds because the lens had to stay open. And think of what that would have. If we could have had pictures of Poe playing leapfrog in the front yard of his house, if we could have had pictures of Poe laughing and joking with his friends, if we had pictures of Poe playing duets with his wife, Virginia, if we had pictures of Poe winning broad jump contests, all of which he did because guess what? He was athletic, and we don't think of Poe as athletic. How would that all change our image of Edgar Allan Poe if we had that kind of record? And none of that exists for Poe, just mostly these gloomy photographs of him staring into a lens of a camera, looking like we want him to look, looking like the goth guy. And again, I'm not saying Poe was not drawn to the creaky cellar door and, what Stephen King called the unquiet coffin. He was drawn to the death culture of America at the time. His hero was Lord Byron in black and was a romantic poet. He patterned himself after that to a certain extent, and he was drawn to those subjects. But that's just a part of who Poe was. And to understand the guy who wrote those stories, you have to understand the rest of who he was. Otherwise, you're just thinking he was some mad genius who was spinning these stories out of some kind of obsession up in that attic we were talking about. And again, that's not. He was a very careful artist and one that had very high standards for himself. And all of that is also not saying, by the way, that alcohol was not a problem for Poe. The one thing I do not want people to get into here is to say, well, this is being an apologist for Poe. Alcohol was clearly a problem for Poe, but not the problem most people think it was. Poe clearly was allergic to alcohol. Exactly why, we'll never know. But from the point he's drinking for the first time, which is when he goes away to college at the University of Virginia. From then on, whenever he's drinking, the record is fairly consistent that it took almost no alcohol to get him roaring drunk. He could take one drink, and he didn't sip it, he didn't savor it. He would charge down the first drink, and immediately it would seem like he had been drunk for hours, and he'd been drinking for hours. And then he took a long time to recover from it. It wasn't just the next morning hangover for him. It took him days in bed to recover from these binges. So Poe definitely has a problem with alcohol. And one of his problems is he picks the wrong time to drink. Every single time. He's one of the most self-destructive writers in history. He always picks the wrong moment to take a drink, and it's always bad for him and bad for everybody around him when he does that. But there are long, long periods of sobriety between those moments when alcohol was a problem for him. So how much did Poe drink? We don't know. And if you want to start a lively debate among Poe scholars, just ask that question.
Well, in the temperance pledge before, or quite a while before arriving in Baltimore. So saying that he was found drunk in Baltimore and would eventually lead to his death, that's may not be have any factor whatsoever in what happened in the last few days of his life.
I agree with that. As a matter of fact, I don't think he was drinking. The main reason that people assumed he was drinking was there are two. One is that he had these moments where People had seen him drunk. So when you see Poe seeming insensible and barely able to stand on the streets of Baltimore, an easy first assumption is that he's been drinking. So that's one thing. And in fact, when he's found, a cousin of his is summoned to the polling place, which was also a bar, a tavern, hotel. When this cousin shows up, he looks at Poe and he assumes that Poe has been drinking. And this cousin later goes on the lecture circuit as an advocate of temperance, and he basically tells people Poe died of drink. Well, there's no evidence of that at all. There was no blood alcohol test. There was no, and the attending doctor, who is every bit as unreliable as the cousin, by the way, but the attending doctor is equally sure Poe wasn't drinking. And there were tests done on Poe's hair. Right after he died, there was snips of his hair taken. That was very common as keepsakes back then. And one of those snips that were taken right after his death were tested, and they don't have the indicators for alcohol. They would show up in the hair, for what you ate and what you drank and things like that. A lot of that, what you were exposed to, shows up. It can show up in tests done on hair. And it all seems to suggest he kept the pledge, that he kept the temperance pledge. And by the way, the temperance pledge was, to a certain extent, to convince Elmira Royster Shelton of Richmond to marry him. He wanted to. He was either engaged when he left Richmond to Elmira, or they had an understanding. They had reached an understanding. Whether there was a formal engagement or not is still. It's like everything else in Poe's life, it's up for debate. He leaves Richmond clearly believing he is engaged to Elmira. And one of the things that he did to sort of convince her was to join the local Sons of Temperance and take the pledge. And there's no proof he broke it. There's absolutely none that he broke that pledge.
Yeah, and what the hair test also ruled out carbon monoxide poisoning. Yes,
the very low levels of carbon monoxide, which was a very good theory up to then, was that they used coal for illuminating gas, and that this gave off CO, and that he would have been breathing. And that's, based on the stereotype. If Poe was the guy in a confined space up in the attic, hunched over with this illuminating gas there, then that's not a bad theory. But the truth is, Poe walked all the time. Poe was not wealthy, so he didn't have a carriage, he didn't have a horse, he didn't have a way to get around. So he walked, and he loved walking. He loved taking long walks. He loved taking long hikes, also not the stereotype of Poe. And he got a lot of fresh air. He was out, he got a lot of exercise and a lot of fresh air. And his levels for poison by illuminating gas were negligible. So yes, that is one of the things I tried to do with the book, was knock down some of the theories that have it's like rabies. Somebody came up with rabies, and this is one of the problems with how Poe died, is that Poe died, if the symptoms are correct, and that's a big if, because the attending physician, I don't think, is reliable. He left behind 3 accounts of Poe's last days, each one of them wildly different. I mean, if you had a witness on the witness stand and he changed his story 3 times, what would you think? So,
yeah, he was very. He seemed almost like he wanted to become some kind of like groupie to, write his version that's similar to, the death report was the same as he died at midnight and all these other things.
Right.
That sound like Poe would have written it.
He changed the time of death.
Yeah.
The attending physician changes the time of death in the account. Actually changes the last words. Well, I think at this point you throw out his testimony. I think this would be thrown out of any court at this point, to say, Doctor, in his account, you say he dies at this time, and you say this, and you say his last words. How careful do you have to be with his last words? And I don't believe either account of the last words. Neither of them sound like Poe. They're this hokey, melodramatic last line that we're supposed to believe were Poe's last words. I don't buy it. But you have, like I said, this is one of the problems with Poe. You have all of these people who wrote about him many years after his death, and many of them had commercial reasons for saying what they said or embellishing the stories or changing the stories. And a lot of the evidence that we have it was ruled out. So there's a lot of things we're always going on. If this is true, then, well, Poe was in the hospital for several days, and it's pretty clear he did take liquids, that they would have given him liquids. They would have given him water. They would have given him bouillon or beef soup or something while he was in the hospital. If he took one sip of that water, it probably rules out rabies, which was a theory which went around for a long time. If you drink, you can't drink if you have rabies. You have a complete aversion to water. If he took one sip, rabies gets ruled out. And I believe he did, and I believe but again, there was no proof that there had been a bite, a wound of any kind. He's in the hospital for several days. His body would have been examined. So, it's not to say you can definitively rule out anything given the unreliability of the witnesses, but, it's pretty clear it's probably not rabies. It's probably not, illuminating gas. There's a lot of things that you can probably sort of say, probably not. But the problem with how Poe died is, if what we know of the symptoms are correct, that he was delirious, that there was moments of lucidity, that the symptoms fit a staggering number of possible causes. So you can bend your theory around the causes, because the causes are common to a lot of things. You say to yourself, well, could that be caused by a brain tumor? Yeah. Could it be caused by encephalitis? Yeah. Could it be caused by rabies? Yep. Can it cause the symptoms of a lot of those things are very similar. And what we do not have is truly reliable information to fill in. Instead of bending the theory to meet the evidence, we need the evidence. And that's what's missing with Poe.
And you get the, what seems to be pretty, standard discussion of the death scene is he's yelling Reynolds. Who's that person? You cover, is that DT, from stopping drinking, but we've already ruled out drinking. So, is this some type of unrelated hallucination or something just invented by another one of the unreliable medical staff?
Well, I think it goes back to Moran. John Moran is the attending physician. He is the only one who left behind accounts, and he's the one who came up with the yelling out the name Reynolds. And that is such a peculiar item that if he had consistently given it in each account, I would give it a lot more credence. But by the second time he tells the story, that item has disappeared from his account. Not only has it disappeared by his account, but the name Reynolds is now given to a family who visits Poe, supposedly visits Poe. And there is no account of a family named Reynolds visiting Poe or why they would. So the doctor has invented a new reason to use the name, the same name. This is beginning to sound a lot like fiction. This is beginning to sound an awful lot like what a fiction writer does, and I think that that is so. Did Poe call out the name Reynolds? Well, an army of people have been searching for the identity of Reynolds, and I do think it could be based on complete misinformation. I don't trust Moran at all. When there are the three accounts changing that much, and you're dealing with something like the death of a great writer, and you're that unreliable, I don't know how we take very much, on faith for what he is saying. So no, I'm not convinced that Poe called out Reynolds. I'm suspicious of almost everything when it comes to the circumstances of Poe's death.
What's he doing in someone else's clothes?
That's a great mystery. See that we know that he's got these ill-fitting clothes, and I mean this seems to support the idea for one of the theories about the missing days that Poe got cooped. And cooping, there was an election going on in Baltimore, and Baltimore was a very, very rough town. And even by East Coast standards, if you had a harbor back then, and you were an East Coast city in America in the 1840s, you had a rough section. You had a section near the docks where, the people came and went, and life could be very cheap. So if Poe arrives from Richmond and he gets off the boat in Baltimore, the theory is that he gets shanghaied by these roving bands who would round up people to become repeat voters. And in between, they would keep them in pens, coops, chicken coop type. That's where it comes from. It says you're cooped up. And that's how it became known as cooping. And there was an election going on at the time. And it's a very good theory to explain Poe's missing days. The problem is there are no witnesses. No one person has ever stepped forward to say, I saw Poe at this polling place. I saw him brought to this polling place. It would explain the why he was wearing somebody else's clothes. Sometimes they change people's clothes so they could be repeat voters, and it would reduce the likelihood of them being recognized if they were wearing different clothes. So sure, it's also a very Baltimore explanation because, back then, Baltimore was such a rough town. Its nickname was Mob Town because they would riot at the drop of a hat. They took their rioting seriously. They would drive the mayor and the sheriff out of town. It would take days to restore order. I mean, people look at riots that go on in American cities and say, isn't that terrible? Read your history. This has been going on, since the earliest days of the Republic. And Baltimore had this down to a fine art. So Poe's in a dangerous city, and he's at a time when there was an election, and cooping is a very, very good theory. I lean towards that theory myself as an explanation for the missing days. It's almost too perfect. It's almost one of those theories that it so fits Baltimore and it so fits all the evidence that you almost want to go, yeah, but it's almost too pat. It's almost, and there are no witnesses. So, I mean, if you put a gun to my head and said, choose, what caused the missing days, I'd go with cooping, because I have never heard a better theory. But I'm also very quick to say there's no proof.
Well, he had a meeting with a doctor. It was like Dr. John Carter.
Yeah, in Richmond.
Okay. So one of his last people that he is talking to before the missing days start is a doctor. The doctor did not really notice
anything out of the ordinary.
Yeah, other than Poe took the wrong cane.
Yeah, he takes Carter's cane, and that's still with him, even though he's in his different clothes. He still has it's a Malacca sword cane. It's a very distinctive cane. Poe he takes it away by mistake and leaves his own cane behind. It's his walking stick. They're not canes; they're walking sticks. They're gentleman's walking sticks. And he still has Carter's sword cane with him when he is found on the streets of Baltimore. It's an odd. If you're writing a detective story and you are looking at very distinctive clues, And that's two things that got to fascinate you, that he's wearing somebody else's clothes. That would immediately become, part of the solution if this was a true mystery story. And he still has Carter's walking stick with him. But I think one of the most interesting things, and that's when, again, you have unreliable witnesses, you also have conflicting testimony. For a long time, the assumption was Poe left Richmond sick, that he was feverish, he was suffering from something. Something was wrong. And this is based on the fact that before he sees Carter, he goes and he visits Elmira Royster Shelton, his fiancée, or his soon-to-be fiancée, depending on what you believe. Well, she left behind an account where she said Poe was feverish. He looked ill. His pulse was racing. And she was so alarmed, she was sure he would not be in any condition to get on the boat later that night and head north. In fact, she, the next day, heads for his rooming house. Sure, he's still going to be there, that he couldn't have possibly. Well, she learns he did leave at that point. And, of course, she never sees him again. But after he left Elmira, he went to Dr. Carter's. He calls on Dr. Carter. He stays. He reads, the magazine. He talks amiably with Carter. Carter's a doctor. And in his account, he does not give any indication that Poe was at all showing signs of distress or being ill. Poe then goes on to dinner. Poe leaves Carter and says, well, I'm going to go and get dinner. And he has dinner with friends. And then these friends take him down to the steamer to head north. And they don't see anything wrong. They don't see it. He was in good spirits. They had a wonderful dinner. They had a good time. And Poe got on the boat. And that's it. Poe gets on the boat. And at that point, he's shielded from our view. Nobody ever steps forward to say, I was on the boat. Now, boats back then had saloons. You could drink on the boat, on the steamers of those times. But nobody has stepped forward to say, yes, I saw Poe drunk, or on the boat, or I had a drink with Poe, or I had a conversation with him at the rail, or nothing. So, these days, these missing days, are it's like a curtain descends on the moment he gets on that steamer, and it does not lift again until he is found on or outside that polling place wearing somebody else's clothes. Now, that's as good a start to a mystery story as I've ever heard. And the fact that nobody has ever stepped forward in the years and years that followed to say, I passed him on the street, anything that tells us he was at this particular point at that moment in those missing days. So again, you have unreliable witnesses, you have conflicting testimony, and you have interpretation of the conflicting and unreliable testimony. All of which always brings us back to, the very first conversation I had about this book, which was with an editor at St. Martin's, and it's curious. I didn't really set out to write a biography of Edgar Allan Poe. Poe has been a favorite author for most of my life. He's in the pantheon of my favorite authors. And he's an author I've carried through my entire life. I have read as much as I could get my hands on. I have an enormous Poe library, and I've read about him and researched him constantly. My wife and I do a two-person collection of Poe material, poems and short stories, which we've done for many, many years. And yet, with all of this great love of Poe and this intimate knowledge of Poe, I never thought of myself as a potential biographer for Poe. This really comes out of this conversation, and it's because I wrote the Twilight Zone book. Everything I need to know I learned in the Twilight Zone had done well enough for St. Martin's that we had the inevitable follow-up conversation. When you sign a book contract, there's always a clause where you owe the publisher an option book. Now, they don't have to do it, but you have to give them the option to publish your next book, and then it's their option to either do it or turn it down, but you have to at least offer it to them. And it's a good clause because, the publisher feels like, well, if we did a book that was successful enough to warrant a next book, then we should at least have a go at that next book. That's fair.
Yeah.
So it came time to sort of have the conversation with an editor about the next book. And I hit this editor with what I thought was my can't miss, slam dunk idea. And the only problem was it missed. It missed badly. He didn't like my slam dunk idea at all. And he countered. He countered with another idea. And I didn't like his idea. So I countered with my second best idea, and that missed too. And we went back and forth like that, volleying back and forth, and him not liking anything I was proposing, and I'm not liking anything he's proposing. It's a very genial conversation. This is not in any way adversarial. It's a very nice conversation. But we were getting to the point of impasse. We were getting to the point where you're going to hang up and table the conversation for another day, when hopefully you'll have a much more fruitful conversation. And just as we were about to hang up, he said, "What about Edgar Allan Poe?" And I said, "Whoa, wait, what made you say that? What made you think that?" And he said, and sometimes it takes somebody else to state the obvious. He said, "Well, it just seems to me he checks a lot of your boxes." And I said, like how? What do you mean? He said, how does he not? You've written about horror topics like Dracula and the Night Stalker. You have written mystery topics like Columbo. He was a critic most of his writing life. You've been a critic most of your writing life. You've written a literary biography, and you have written books about a great 19th century American author, Mark Twain. How does this not check all your boxes? And I thought, well, you know what? I get
good point.
But then it became like, well, what kind of book are you talking about? And it was clear that he was talking about a book about the mystery of how Poe died. And I immediately sort of said, whoa, wait, whoa. You are not seriously suggesting we write a book like the one that seems to get published every 2 years, promising you the solution to the mystery of Jack the Ripper's identity. Every 2 years there seems, and this one of the, like they arrive like clockwork on the noon stage, and you get a new book saying, no, we've got the answer this time, and we really can solve this definitively. And I said, well, you're not really suggesting we do that kind of book for Poe, are you? Because this is as cold a case as you can get. This is a man who died in 1849. There was no death certificate, no autopsy. Even if there had been an autopsy, it would probably be worthless because they didn't know what they were doing for the most part with autopsies back then, and it would have been done with the equivalent of butcher's instruments. If Poe had lived a few more years, he would have gotten a very good autopsy because the Civil War is what brought the art of the autopsy into the modern age, because we got very good at dissecting human bodies during the Civil War. But Poe dies in 1849 when they wouldn't have even known what they were looking for. So no death certificate, no autopsy, no surviving soft tissue that can be subjected to modern forensics, unreliable witnesses all over the place, conflicting evidence all over the place. I said, if that's the kind of book you want me to write, then you better find yourself another lunatic, because this one's driving away. And he said, so we talked about it. I said, I tell you what, I'll write you this book. How about I write an examination of Poe's life through the prism of his death? In other words, we use his death as a filter of examining how he lived, because I'm much more, as I said before, I'm much more interested in how Poe lived than how he died. And if I can come up with a convincing argument for how Poe died, I will make it, but I will not go so far as to claim I can prove it. I'm not going to claim there's evidence that exists that will definitively solve a case. In other words, I will build a case, but the best it could ever be is circumstantial. And, I'm like a detective. I approach this like a detective, building a case. And at the end of the book, you're sort of like the district attorney. I've given you all the evidence. Would you take this to court based on what I've given you? Do you think there's a strong enough case here to take it to court? I don't know the answer to that. That's up to every individual who reads the book to decide.
I think you make some very valid point. I've heard a lot, the alcohol, rabies, the brain tumor, from the moving of the body from the first resting place to the grave you could see now, and the rattling inside the skull. That's a possibility, and ruling out things. You're bringing in the OTC testing from 5,000 years ago.
That's right. That's right.
So I think you do present convincing evidence of what very may well be the explanation for why Poe died at an early age. You rule out a lot of things, like you already discussed. If you're drinking water, you don't have rabies, so you ruled that out. So I was thoroughly impressed. Very good points.
Let me put it this. I like the solution that I suggest, but I'm very clear. I don't insist on it.
You present it. There it is for you to accept it or
But I'm
reject
not
it.
going to say this has to be the answer. That's saying that this is what I think is the answer. I sure would like some hard evidence. I'm an evidence guy, and I want some hard evidence to support this. And I look for it. But I think, I think I've built a very strong circumstantial case, and circumstantial cases, people do get convicted on circumstantial cases. If the link of evidence is strong enough, a DA will take a circumstantial case to court, and if it's strong enough, it will convince a jury. So I think I've got a pretty good circumstantial case that I've built. I think the difference between, my book and anybody else's who have attached this is I'm very clear at what can and can't be proven. And I'm also, I don't insist that this be the answer. I'm also pretty clear on the fact that I'm not even sure I want it solved. That we would certainly lose as much as we gain. Maybe we'd lose more if this mystery were solved, because it's part of the romance of Poe's mystique, is that he has this mystery surrounding his death, and we keep trying to solve it. I think that's wonderful in a way. It's like I said, if people come away from this with a better understanding of how Poe might have died, that's wonderful. But I really want people to have a better understanding of who Poe was and how he lived, and who the guy was who wrote these stories. It's like if you go back to 1960, let's say, and the dawn of that amazing decade, when so many things got turned upside down and inside out. If you look at the very, very beginning of that decade, and you look at the two writers we've talked about, the two iconic writers of the 19th century,
Poe and Twain.
Poe and Twain, their reputations are universally recognized writers going into the 1960s, and both of their reputations are somewhat based on stereotype. Poe's, as we've already discussed, is basically the macabre, somber, maybe mad spinner of horror tales. And Twain is the genial, grandfatherly man of letters, the family author, the boys' author, the dispenser of witticisms. And there was a lot more to Twain, just as there was a lot more to Poe. The difference is, as we move through the 1960s, Twain's suppressed writings started to get published and come out. And it expands our view of Twain. We now accept that Twain was this great social critic, that he had these darker aspects to his personality. And all of this has expanded our view of Twain. Amazingly, though, for those who might be afraid, Twain's own daughter was afraid of this, that this might hurt his reputation. It enhanced his reputation. We did not lose Twain, the grandfatherly man of letters. We didn't lose the genial wit. We just gained all these other Mark Twains, and it enriched our view of him. Poe comes out of the 1960s, the same guy he went in. Poe, we get to the end of this, Poe's every bit as popular, but there was no attempt to broaden our view of Poe and say, yes, but Poe is also this, this, and this. And therefore, our view of Poe has remained static to this day. Our view of Poe largely today is the same view we had of him in 1960. And what I want to say to people, you don't have to be afraid of losing the man who made us afraid. He ain't going nowhere. That guy's always going to be there. That guy is rock solid. By accepting that there was a lot more to Poe, we're not going to lose that other Poe. We're just going to gain an understanding of how he actually wrote those stories. And in order to do that, the very first thing we've denied him, which is a sense of humor. Poe was a richly comic guy, and this was something which I started to suspect long, long ago, not only from reading Poe and realizing how much humor there is. Even in the horror stories, there's some richly funny moments, but also reading his criticism, which have some razor sharp blasts in them, very funny, and then his humor that he wrote, his satires, his hoaxes. All of these things, I knew Poe had a sense of humor, but the other thing that drove it home was getting to know a lot of horror writers. And one thing that I noticed about almost every horror writer and horror director and even horror actors that I interviewed over the years, and I interviewed a lot of them, is they had one thing in common. Almost all of them have of humor. And when I commented on this to people like Robert Bloch, who wrote Psycho, or Stephen King, they said, well, of course, you have to have a sense of humor to do this. It is part of the essential makeup of a horror writer to have a sense of humor. You'd go crazy if you tried to write this stuff and you did not have a sense of humor to keep you grounded. So in other words, Poe not only had a sense of humor, he had to have had a sense of humor. It's the first thing we deny him, and it's the most essential part of his makeup he had to have. And the more you learn about Poe, the more you realize, oh, yeah, he did. He did have a great sense of humor, and he was funny. And he needed it to write those stories. So in order to understand the Poe who wrote The Telltale Heart and The Cask of Amontillado and The Mask of the Red Death, in order to understand that Poe, you have to understand the real person and where the writing came from and how it came from. And like Vincent Price told me about Poe, that Poe was absolutely curious about, he had one of the most acquisitive minds. He was interested in science, in rocks, in flowers, in physics, in travel, in geography, in religions and languages. And he is interested in everything, and that is something that a horror writer also needs, is this ability to be interested in this wide world around you. And these are things that work against the stereotype of Poe. And and once you realize that this was who Poe was, it makes the fact that he wrote the horror stories and was so good at it logical. It's like, that's why he was so good. He wasn't good at it just because he was some freak of nature. He was good at it because of all the other parts of his personality, all synced up beautifully to be this great horror writer.
Yeah, and you, with a statement like that, you kind of give us an indication of what his mom was like.
I'm sorry. What is? Did you say his mother?
Yeah, she would.
Yeah.
She or he seemed to have a very similar mindset.
Yeah.
Like
if you Elizabeth, who dies very young, she's only 24 of tuberculosis, and Poe is he's 2 going on 3 when she dies, and most accounts put him at the deathbed. She was an amazing actress. Now, being an actor in America in around 1810, 1811, this is a very, very tough existence. You had to learn a lot of roles. You had to commit a lot of roles to by heart, because you had to be ready to go at any point to play anything from Shakespeare to comedy to melodrama to music. You had to be able to dance. You had to be able to do comic bits. You had to be able to sing. And if you weren't doing any of that, you were probably taking tickets in the box office, or you were moving set pieces, and the theaters themselves were death traps. They almost always burned down, and the conditions where the dressing rooms were rat infested and just disease ridden. The hotels you stayed in were terrible. If yellow fever or cholera were raging, you'd probably get it because you were out there living this very, very hard life. And Poe's mother was tough. She was the daughter of actors, and she had been brought up to work hard. And Poe got not only his creativity and his touch of genius from Elizabeth, he also got her work ethic. He's a very hard worker, and this works against the mystique of Poe, because we prefer to think of him as being inebriated all the time, but he had a tremendous work ethic, especially when he's working as an editor of the magazines. He's doing a tremendous amount of work for those magazines, staggering amount of work, and unfortunately, his father, David Poe, he inherited some things from David as well. He inherited some of the bad things from David. David Poe had a problem with alcohol. David Poe was extraordinarily sensitive to criticism. Poe got that. And so he inherits things from both parents, but a lot of the things that are sort of the mark of genius. And that's interesting, too, is that later in life, Poe does not disown his heritage. And you have to remember that when Poe is adopted by the Allan family, and he's never really adopted, he's a foster child. They never formally adopt him, and then ultimately John Allan disinherits him. But he has pretensions of being a Virginia aristocrat, a gentleman, and that class looked on the theater with abhorrence. There was one of the nicknames for the theater was the legs of Satan. Actors were viewed as maybe one step up from prostitutes in that time. And Poe was very proud, particularly of his mother. And he never disowned the fact that he was the son of an actress, and a great actress. And he was always very proud of it. And he proclaimed it in print. There's one amazing thing he wrote in the last few years of his life, where he says the author of this piece is not only the son of an actress, but a great actress, and says it proudly and has never denied it. So he's very proud of that. Which is one of the most admirable things about him, that he doesn't disown the Poe. If anything, he disowns the Allan part, because he gets the Allan part from John Allan, which becomes his middle name, but he didn't use it. Another misnomer about Poe. He was not Edgar Allan Poe to the public. He was either Edgar Poe or E.A. Poe or Edgar A. Poe, but he was not Edgar. He very rarely signed his name Edgar Allan Poe. We've made him Edgar Allan Poe. And I think he would just as soon the Allan part not even be part of it, because he ended on very, very bad terms with John Allan.
Yeah, Mark, in your A Mystery of Mysteries, you do talk about literary forensics, and you do consult with your buddy John Douglas and our friend Mark Kolchak, and I think Barbara has a photo of with you signing your Shawshank book that I sent to my friend, the Red Dragon Rider, and Johnny and Helen Holmes are at the hotel restaurant, and Mark sitting behind us. But I made copies of that photo. But Mark is really, or Mark and John are just a fascinating writing team. Just looking at all these little details that we've been discussing. What did you learn from discussing, bringing them in to discuss their views of all this craziness that no one's been able to figure out all what happened to Poe in the last few days?
And it was I was saying about how I took some chances with the book, and one of them was the dual narrative, because again, I just didn't want to write a traditional biography of Poe. But when you do that, you kind of know you're leading with your chin a bit, because you're very exposed when it'd be very easy to play it safe and write a traditional narrative for life. So when you do it this way, it's sort of like being on the high diving board and hoping there's water in the pool when you hit. But one of the chances I took was doing interviews for the book, because conventionally, you do not do interviews with people for somebody who died in 1849. There's nobody left to talk to who saw that person or knew him. But I was a journalist for 43 years, and I used the skills of a journalist, a detective, a documentarian, if you will, in this. And there are voices throughout the book derived from interviews. And what I did was I went to all sorts of experts on various aspects of Poe's life and death. And I interviewed a forensic pathologist, forensic archaeologists, medical historians, medical experts of all types, and various Poe scholars who have minutely studied various aspects of his life. And I view this as sort of like the detective, and these are my witnesses. These are my expert witnesses. And I went to them and I asked them very specific questions about very specific aspects of Poe's life and career. So I went to Mark Kolchak and John Douglas, primarily because I wanted an FBI agent, and I wanted the best. And I wanted, his view of how an FBI agent would view this case if it were presented to him. So that was one of the questions I had for John. But I also wanted, John and Mark have both been, and they said this in one of the Mindhunter books, Poe is widely credited as being the father of the modern detective story. He created the character in C. Auguste Dupin, who is basically the role model for Sherlock Holmes and all of the master sleuths that are going to follow. Conan Doyle himself said that. Conan Doyle basically said the mystery story was nowhere until Poe comes up with Dupin and writes The Murders in the Rue Morgue. So Conan Doyle gave Poe full credit in a number of occasions. So we grant that Poe is the father of the modern detective story. Mark Olshaker and John Douglas, however, believe that Poe was actually the father of modern profiling, the expertise that John pioneered at the FBI, and did this through his use of rational profiling in his mystery stories. That may seem like a pretty wild claim for me to make. And if I made that claim for Poe, people might have oh, come on, you're stretching this a bit. It's a lot different when Mark Olshaker and John Douglas make that claim. So one of the reasons I wanted to talk to them was I wanted their view on that. Is Poe actually the father of modern profiling? According to John Douglas, he is. And there's no greater authority on the subject than John Douglas. That's the reason I went for these voices. These were people who could say things with authority, with great authority, and say it based on their own expertise. So, if I have, one of the leading experts on, a certain disease or a certain city where Poe was living at a time, I went to them and said, tell me about this. You know more than I could ever know in studying a lifetime because you have spent a lifetime studying this. Let me tap your fine mind and use your expertise. Tell me about this. And that is how I built, my witnesses in all of this, was to talk to people who then, now that is a very unconventional way to write a biography. And by the way, I encouraged all of them to speak as candidly as possible, not to speak as, serious-minded academics or, cop speak or forensic speak. I encouraged all of them to put it in ways that would be relatable by people not of their professions. And from that came gold. Almost everybody came through. So that when I quoted them in a way that I think really helps bring Poe's story alive. Ed Pettit, who is at the Rosenbach Archives and Museum in Philadelphia. Now, one of the things that people do not know about Poe is, if I was to say, what cities do you associate Poe with? Most people would come up with Baltimore first. Because Baltimore has embraced, but now in truth, Poe didn't live in Baltimore very long. He actually lived for a few years in Baltimore in the 1830s. And his family was from there traditionally. The Poes were from Baltimore. But he was born in Boston, and he grew up in Richmond. And he only lives in Baltimore for a couple of years. But he ends up dying there. And that's it. That's the big thing, so there's a friendly rivalry among the cities that claim Poe. And truly, 5 cities have a very good claim on Poe. Boston, because he was born there, New York, because he was living there the last few years of his life, and that's where he was living when The Raven was published, and was where he was living when he died. Baltimore. Richmond, because he grows up in Richmond. So Boston, New York, Baltimore, Richmond. And then the 5th city is Philadelphia. And Philadelphia is probably the one we associate with him the least. And yet, he lives in Philadelphia for about 6 years. 6 of his adult years are spent. That's not inconsiderable for a man who only lives to be 40. And those 6 years are his prime years as a writer. He lives in 5 different residences when he's in Philadelphia. And he writes most of his best-known stories. When he writes The Fall of the House of Usher, The Pit and the Pendulum, The Black Cat, The Telltale Heart, Murders in the Rue Morgue, The Gold Bug. These all come out of the Philadelphia years. The Philadelphia years are his prime years as a short story writer, for writing the things for which we most remember him for. And poor Philadelphia gets the least association with Poe. So, I asked Ed Pettit about this as a literary spokesman for the city of Philadelphia. And again, I had told Ed to speak as colloquially as possible. And Ed said, when you go into the Hall of Fame in baseball, you go in under the jersey for the team for which you put up the big numbers. Poe put up his big numbers here in Philadelphia. This is where he's on the hitting streak. Now, who says it that way? Who puts it that way? But what a relatable, wonderful way to put Poe's literary accomplishments, his golden years, into perspective, is that he put up his big numbers here. That's a great way to put it. And no other biography is going to have that phrase in it, related to Poe. So, and that's just one example. There were so many wonderful examples of that. I think a lot of these, I really do hope that these scholars really enjoyed talking to me, because I really did encourage them to talk in a way that was very much relatable, not to other scholars, but to, this was meant to be a popular biography. I told all of them, I'm not trying to write a scholarly biography. I'm not that person. As I said before, I'm not an academic. I'm a working writer. This is a working writer's book about a writer. And so there's got to be better people to write the standard academic biography. There better be better people to do that. And I would never put myself forward to be that person. This is very much meant to be a popular biography, and therefore I used the tools of the journalist. I know that there are going to be some people who read the book and object to that. I know there are going to be some people who will not like the dual timeline. And if they object to that, all I will say is I will paraphrase what Stephen King said when he said that if you object to the types of stories I write, if you object to my inclination to write about things horrific and terrifying, all I can tell you is it's what I have. And I think that's exactly what I would say about this book. If you don't like the way it's written, it's fair. I nobody has to like what you do, and that's fair. But it's what I have. I brought the skills that I have had as a writer, and I'm not going to all of a sudden pretend to be a different kind of writer or a different type of a different person than I am.
When this book came out, you've been doing some regional library talks and lectures here and there. How are the audiences responding to your discussions?
Oh, so far, wonderfully. I have to say, I think talking about Poe is, you're not going in and talking about, the essays of Emerson or some old English author like Hazlitt or some such thing. You're talking about Edgar Allan Poe, and that's fun. And it should be fun. If I can't make Edgar Allan Poe fun, then I would need to hang it up. I bring a great deal of passion to these talks, and it's genuine. It's not faked in any way. I truly love talking about Edgar Allan Poe, and I think the audiences do. And I think that's reflective of one reason Poe is still alive as an author. I get into this in the book a bit, but Poe is our true renewable energy source from a literary standpoint. Poe keeps getting reintroduced in curriculum. And it's marvelous. Everybody gets Poe. You got Poe. I got Poe. All God's children get Poe. And the reason is because in junior high school, usually from about the 7th grade, they give you Poe for the first time. And then you keep getting him. You get him through high school, and then if you go on to college and take English courses, you're going to get him again. And English teachers love teaching Poe. And the kids love getting it. Because by the time you're in the 7th grade, most 7th graders have an antipathy towards reading. Reading is a chore. Reading is onerous. A lot of that's because of what we give kids to read. We give them all the wrong things, and we give them things that almost are guaranteed to kill off a love of reading. And so, let me have the curriculum for a few days, and I will, create generations of readers, which will last unto your children and your children's children. It's just so sad that we do this. But the one thing we do right is we give them Poe, and we almost inevitably give them Poe at that great age, of being young teenagers. And they've been getting all of this heavy writing, right? This is reading. Then all of a sudden we give them Poe. And Poe's walling people up in catacombs and dismembering corpses and locking them up in torture chambers. And
yep.
All of a sudden people are like, this is reading? Oh, this is great, And it's wonderful stuff to give people at that age because it just fires up your imagination. And again, the students just love getting Poe at that age. And then the teachers love teaching it because it's reading that really, for all the death and dying, it really comes alive, doesn't it?
Yeah, I've found that too. And
then that gets constantly reintroduced. So everybody gets it, and you're constantly meeting people when you say, we're going to talk about Poe, and they'll tell you something like, in the 7th grade, I had to memorize the first 3 stanzas of The Raven. You want to hear them? I can still do it. And once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered weak and weary, they're right into it. It's wonderful, and I think that is one of the things that makes Poe fun is. That's not true with any other writer. There's no other writer that you can come in and they kind of have that personal connection that was forged at that incredible age. And it's why he can still be marketable. It's why we can still, we put him on T-shirts and we make him bobbleheads and action figures and put him on buttons and put him on mugs and put him on everything. It's Poe's everywhere. Yeah, you can go to a bookstore, whether it be a BAM or a Barnes & Noble, and you could see like 2 or 3 shelves of Poe merchandise. Where's the Longfellow merchandise? Where are the shelves dedicated to Emerson?
Mm-hmm.
You've got like 2 or 3 shelves of merchandise. You can go on Etsy, and there are thousands upon thousands of Poe items available. There's no distant second for a writer, for not Shakespeare, not anybody who comes anywhere close to the amount of merchandise that's available for Poe. And it's not just that we know him, and it's not just that we recognize who he is, it's that we also recognize the writing. It's not like if I say The Telltale Heart, they don't know what I'm, all of a sudden, well, what are you talking about? They know exactly what I'm talking about. That's the one where the guy cuts out the guy's heart and puts it under the floorboards. Yeah, that's it, all right. They know The Raven. They know the stories. They know The Pit and the Pendulum or The House of Usher. And, Hollywood's been a great ally in all of this. From the 1930s on, we had the Universal Poe films, Poe in quotes, with Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi, like The Black Cat and The Raven and The Murders in the Rue Morgue. And then in the 60s, we got the Roger Corman films with Vincent Price. And those films rarely had anything to do with Poe. A lot of those movies were just called The Raven or whatever. Some of them had more to do with Poe. The House of Usher and The Mask of the Red Death by Corman are both very good films. But Hollywood has sort of kept Poe going here too. They've been in. How many times can you say that Hollywood has been in conspiracy with curriculum to keep an author up? But it's true. And you mentioned before, how often does Poe get referenced? And we know that people are going to recognize him when he gets referenced in The Simpsons, or gets referenced in South Park, or goes
SpongeBob.
or SpongeBob does their turn on the Telltale Heart. Exactly right. Is they're going to get it. They're going to recognize where this is coming from. And so Hollywood and curriculum have been two pillars that Poe's reputation has stood on in all these years. And here he is. He's barreling in, through the 21st century as the most read and most popular American author. And I think Twain is still as recognized, but he's not as read. The problem with Twain is he's dropped out of curriculum for the most part. He presents difficulties, which, of putting his writing into historical context, which is difficult to do. And rather than face the difficulties, a lot of academic institutions have just chosen to drop him out of curriculum. And I don't think his great works get read as much as they used to. I don't think we're in the danger of Twain going away, but I think we quote Twain more than we read him. We recognize him still, and I think he gets quoted equally. He's probably the most quoted American author. But I think Poe is the best read because we actually read Poe, and we enjoy reading Poe. And so there's no resistance to it. And that's true of horror, too, is that Poe becomes this tradition of, that's going to go on. And horror always gives you that wonderful metaphoric way of dealing with things. And so, it gets a pass often enough. It doesn't get the respect that it's due, but it also kind of gets that pass. So Poe is also credited with being the person who's going to give us Stephen King and Neil Gaiman and Anne Rice and all of these other writers who acknowledge Poe as the headwaters, as the master of all this. So all of that, I think, has come together to create a perfect storm, which would be a perfect Poe symbol and something like the descent into the maelstrom. He would, it has come together to ensure his immortality as an American author. And that's why I say, Poe's, the ultimate part of Poe's story, as sad as his life was and as hard as his life was, it's a good ending. It's a happy ending from when you step back and look at it. It's because you're going to soar higher than any of them, Eddie. Just hold on, buddy. You want to go back and tell him. You wish there was a way to go back and say to him, "Don't worry, you're the one they're going to remember." I said that to a Poe scholar, and she said, "I think he knew." And I thought about it for a second. I nodded my head. I said, "Yeah, I think you're right. I think he knew," because he was that smart. He was that smart, and he knew. I think that history was on his side, and it sure has been.
So if he would not have died at the age of 40 in 1949 with, just say Moby Dick a couple years later and The House of the Seven Gables and, getting closer to Uncle Tom's Cabin in the Civil War, where do you think Poe was going had he lived another 15, 20 years?
That's a favorite speculation among Poe scholars and Poe fans, and there's really no way of knowing. That's all it ever can be, is speculation. It's one of those. What I like to say is like, what would have happened if Spartacus had a Piper Cup? Would he have won? You know, we don't know. You know, it didn't happen. So how do we know? And Poe, you can argue it a lot of different ways. I think the easy assumption is that, well, Poe was raised in a slave-owning culture. He viewed himself primarily as a Virginian. Virginia was the seat of the Confederacy. So had he lived, he was anti-abolitionist. He did not like the abolitionists. So is the easy assumption that Poe would have joined the Confederate cause and fought for Virginia. That's a very easy assumption because Poe was also a Whig. His politics were Whiggish, and the Whigs are going to become the Republicans. They're going to become the party of Abraham Lincoln. So it's too easy to sort of say immediately. And Poe lives the vast majority of his professional life in two northern cities, Philadelphia and New York. The last 12 years of his life, 11 or 12 years of his life, are spent, he doesn't live in the South. He doesn't live, he visits Richmond. But his residences for the last are northern cities, are Philadelphia and New York. And there's also a debate at how much Poe, how much Southern identity meant to Poe. Did he sort of accent his Southernness when it was convenient? He was very good at fitting in northern cultures. And I don't think Poe actually viewed himself as a Northerner or a Southerner. And I could be wrong. I mean, like I said, I'm with everybody else. I'm just speculating. I'm playing with the bank's money here. I don't know anything more about this than anybody else does. But I do believe that Poe viewed himself as a citizen of the world. I think he had a bigger view of himself. I don't think he viewed himself, as a Northerner, a Southerner, a sectionalist, or anything like that. I think Poe thought of himself as an internationalist, and I think he had a much bigger view of himself. And so in the 10 years between, he dies and when, we're heading inexorably towards a civil war, Poe could have changed many times. His viewpoints could have changed many times. And we don't know where he would have gone. He dies at 40. And I think one of the things about Poe that's interesting is that, there are a lot of writers who die in that span of 40 to 40, 45, 46 years old. A lot of great writers died in that either heart attacks or tuberculosis or something, that got them at that point. But F. Scott Fitzgerald dies at 44. Flannery O'Connor dies about that age. Jack London, Robert Louis Stevenson, Anton Chekhov. They all kind of check out in this 40 to 45, 46 range. And in almost every instance, when a writer dies at that age, people will say, what would they have accomplished? What would they have done if they had lived a normal lifespan? Because 40 to 60 is kind of considered prime time for a writer. 40 to 60 is the sweet spot where you have gained enough life experience and experience in writing to put it all together and write what's going to be your masterpieces. So there's always kind of this feeling when a Flannery O'Connor or an F. Scott Fitzgerald dies about that age that this is a life cut short and it's an unfinished life. There's not that same sense with Poe. Poe dies at 40, and yet there's a sense of completeness. There's a sense that he did what he was meant to do with those 40 years, largely because he does so much, and he does so much at high quality. He finds time to write this great poetry. He finds time to create the modern horror story. He finds time to create the modern detective story, to do all this incredible criticism. And there's this feeling of completeness when he dies, of where was he heading? What works would he have done? It's very, very difficult to say with Poe. he has this very, very productive, he's very productive and industrious until Virginia dies, his wife dies. And then he kind of falls apart. And it's one of the few fallow periods, the months leading up to Virginia's death, and then the year and a half that followed. It's a period where he produces very, very little writing of any kind. And one reason is that he's in bad shape, emotionally and certainly physically. He's starting to fall apart. So there's this fallow period. But then at the very end, almost how like when people say when people are dying, they have right before they enter the last phase, there's almost a period where they bloom and they look really healthy for a little while. And then they very well, Poe sort of has that from a literary standpoint. At the very end, he has this renaissance where all of a sudden he comes alive, and he writes two of his best short stories, The Cask of Amontillado and Hop Frog, both of which are revenge stories, by the way, and two of my favorites. I don't like revenge. I don't believe in it, and yet they're two of my favorite Poe stories. I don't know why. But he writes these two amazing stories towards the end, and he has this return to poetry, his first love. And he writes most of his poetry at the very beginning of his career. And then he's very busy. He's writing all these short stories, and he's editing magazines, and he's doing all this criticism. And he kind of, poetry takes a back seat. And he does The Raven in 1845, and that certainly does. But then at the end, he has this kind of return to poetry, and he writes The Bells, and he writes Annabelle Lee, and he writes El Dorado. And this is all sort of at the end where you get this last wonderful flourishing of the poet. And then he dies, and then he's gone. So where he would have gone next, there are certainly unfulfilled aspects to Poe's career as a writer. He never really wrote a great novel. He wrote one novel. He made one attempt at a novel. It's an endlessly interesting, very strange novel. But he never does return to that. He never has, the time and the energy to dedicate and the resources to dedicate. It's certainly something that you kind of look at and go, would he have written something in bringing all of that together, all of that, those amazing parts of his personality, the mystery writer, the horror writer, the poet, the critic, all of those essential parts, and written a novel which in some way brought all of those aspects of his genius together. I don't know. Nobody knows. And nobody knows if it was, but it does seem like if there was something missing. If you look at the four major writers who sort of brought horror into the modern age in the 19th century, it starts with Mary Shelley, who precedes Poe. And Mary Shelley, obviously with Frankenstein, which has an enormous impact on both horror and science fiction. So it starts with Mary Shelley, and then and then it goes on to Robert Louis Stevenson, who, not only with Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, but also The Body Snatcher and all of the amazing short stories he wrote that fell on the spooky side of the street. And then it ends in 1897 with the publication of Dracula by Bram Stoker. And those are that's the Mount Rushmore of horror writers for the 1800s. And if you look at those four, you always have to say which of these four is not like the others. Well, only one of them has a first name that does not begin with the letter S. So let's start there. We have Shelley, Stevenson, and Stoker. Only one of these does not come from the British Isles. Stoker is Irish, Shelley is English, and Stevenson is Scottish. Poe is the lone American in the group. Only one of these did not write a landmark seminal horror novel. Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein. Stevenson wrote Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Stoker writes Dracula. Poe does it all with the short story form. So Poe is right there. He's one of the four that you put on the Mount Rushmore of horror writers. And it's not to say there weren't other really important horror writers of the 1800s. Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu comes to mind, and others. But Henry James is in there. But these four, right, this is it. This is the big four. This is the Beatles of horror literature here. And if you sort of look at those, Poe stands out in so many ways because he is not like the others in so many ways. And I think it's neat that he is the sole American in there because he the one thing he does not have is that novel, that one novel that would be stand shoulder to shoulder with Frankenstein and Dracula and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So, I think it's always fun to sort of speculate where Poe would have gone, not only politically and personally, but also, there's just so much that's one of the great things about Poe. There's just everything is up for grabs and speculation with Poe, and you can always argue it both ways. You can always sort of say, well, yeah, he would have done this, and this, and then you say, yeah, on the other hand, and there's always another hand with Poe. There is always, there's always another where you go, yes, but how about this? And I think that's one of the things that makes him fascinating.
Okay, so you've mentioned your talks with Stephen King and interviewing him for your book on the Shawshank Redemption. You also were good friends with Richard Matheson from the Twilight Zone and Duel. What was Poe's influence on Richard's writing career?
I never asked that directly. Isn't that odd? Because Richard wrote a lot of the Roger Corman Poe films. And you would think I would have had a deeper conversation with him about Poe. I don't think, and this is going to sound strange, because given that he did write the Poe adaptations, I don't think Poe resonated with Richard as much as it did other writers. But I don't think there's any question that Poe had an influence. Poe had a tremendous influence on Charles Beaumont, who was Richard's close friend and fellow Twilight Zone writer. A bigger avowed influence on Beaumont than he was on Matheson. But there's no escaping it. Poe influenced them all either directly or indirectly. Stephen King said that. Stephen King said, if Poe hadn't influenced him directly, he certainly influenced all the guys who influenced him. So it doesn't matter whether he influenced him directly or not. He still influenced him because all the horror writers who followed were influenced by Poe, and not just horror writers. Also, all kinds of writers were influenced by Poe. F. Scott Fitzgerald. Fitzgerald cheered Poe and celebrated Poe. Poe was one of his primary influences. You don't really think of Fitzgerald and Poe in the same.
I wouldn't have thought that either.
Yeah, but you do have this. A lot of people who just thought George Bernard Shaw was a tremendous Poe fan. So you have all of these writers who were profoundly influenced by Poe. And so even if there was no direct influence on one, now Ray Bradbury was tremendously influenced by Poe and paid tribute to Poe in several of his own stories. There's several stories, a couple of which, and Poe actually shows up as a character and others where he makes reference. He does his own version of the Telltale Heart. He does his own version of the House of Usher. And again, Ray said that Poe took the Heart story and made literature of it, and I think that's as insightful a description of Poe as we're ever going to get. So yeah, whether you were directly influenced by Poe or not, but certainly plenty of people like Neil Gaiman and Anne Rice and many, many others, basically said, yeah, Poe was the guy. Poe was the early influence and the great influence. And I think you've also seen Poe acknowledged as a great influence on crime writers, thriller writers, writers of fantasy and horror, and in some cases science fiction, and music. There's a tremendous number of rock stars and popular artists who have spoken of their great love for Edgar Allan Poe. And I think that, again, that's another one of those things that gives him street cred that a lot of other writers don't have. I mean, the man's name checked in songs by John Lennon and Bob Dylan. Who's got that? Yeah. Where's the name checks for Hemingway and in the songs of John Lennon and Bob Dylan? That's it's great. I mean, Annabelle Lee has been set to music and performed by rock stars and country stars. Yeah, you again, who's setting Longfellow's poems to music?
The Yardbirds did A Dream Within a Dream.
Yes, yeah. There's several versions of that. Yeah, that's exactly right.
Iron Maiden's Murders in the Rue Morgue.
Right. He's inspired opera. He's inspired ballet. He's inspired rock music, country music. It just that's one of the things I think it's cool to like Edgar Allan Poe. It's you never, and I think that's one of the things that we were talking about. How are these talks going? I think it's one of the things that make it fun, that make it tremendous fun. Everybody has one of those indirect influences, and then something which is in the realm of homage. And whether that is a story by Ray Bradbury or an episode of The Simpsons or a song by John Lennon or whatever it is, it's there. And I'm sure that Baltimore alone, and I give Baltimore full credit for this. I don't know any other example of a town that has so embraced a literary figure as Baltimore has. Now Baltimore is very proud of the association with Poe. And there is this kind of friendly rivalry between the cities of who gets him. And Baltimore kind of wins because Baltimore has been so aggressive in its embracing of Poe. He also died there, and they like to say in Baltimore, "We got the body, we win." But it's also true that the town has done a tremendous amount of. Is there any other sports team anywhere that is named for a literary reference? Football, baseball.
I don't think
hockey.
so.
Yeah, can you find another reference? But the team is the Ravens, and it's because they're in Baltimore, and it's because of Edgar Allan Poe. We sort of accept that without even thinking. And it's like there are no other teams named for a literary character. There's no literary reference, but there is in Baltimore. So I really give Baltimore full credit for so thoroughly embracing and really, really, pardon the expression, on the association with Poe.
Well, you also have Nabokov's Lolita, as well as Kubrick's version, The Divine Edgar.
Oh, there's so much. I mean, you could do a forever anthology on works which were either directly influenced by Poe or indirectly influenced him. You could do the same thing with movies. You could do the same thing with television. So many with novels which have either used Poe as a story through or as an actual character. It's just that is all based on the idea, on the acceptance that you're going to recognize the name and that you're going to recognize a certain part of his literary output. And by the way, you know, I said before, I think, you know, when we were saying, like, where would Poe have gone? Well, you know, we don't know that, but we only know what we know. But I always had to think that the more interesting speculation is, what would Poe think of his reputation today? If Poe could you know, magically come back for one day and observe how he is perceived, I think he would be at the same time delighted and appalled. He certainly would be delighted that he is so well known and so universally recognized. I think he would be horrified that his reputation had been reduced to just being a horror writer. And he wouldn't have even known what that term meant, by the way. None of the writers we mentioned before would have known what that term meant. If you had said to Stevenson or Shelley, or Poe for that matter, oh, you're a horror writer, they would have looked at you like, the term didn't exist. And they said, like, you mean Gothic? Do you mean I write Gothic? And they would have said, well, yeah, so suppose, you know, I like to tell a good spooky story every once in a while, but only if that's the best way to tell the story. You know, Stevenson would have said, well, you know, today I'm writing Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, but tomorrow I'm writing Treasure Island. And the next day I'm writing A Child's Garden of Verses. And the next day I'm writing an essay or a travel book. The term horror writer is really a 20th century American conceit, the branding of authors, the reducing them to a label. Well, you know, I'm a writer. What kind of writer are you? Do you have to be a kind of writer? The marketing of writers dictated you did. So Stephen King is a horror writer. You know, Raymond Chandler is a mystery writer. You know, these guys were all kinds of writers. They didn't know you had to choose. We chose for them. Instead of they choosing, we decided, well, Edgar Allan Poe is a horror writer.
Hey, Mark, we're down to about the last minute.
Okay.
And I just wanted to thank you. The audience had 2 marks tonight, talking about 3 marks, if we include Mark Olshaker, 2 graves. And it sounds like all these dualities you find in the House of Usher. But thank you so much for this wonderful show. I'm sure the audience got a lot out of it, and you're always welcome to come back whenever you have your next project out, or just talk about something else.
I appreciate it, and I'm sure our paths will cross again soon.
I hope so. Okay, we'll see everyone sometime soon. Take care, everyone. Good night.